So welcome to today's Religion Media Centre briefing, which is on 100 years of religion at the BBC on today, which is its 100th anniversary. And we'll be charting the story from the very first days of the British Broadcasting Company, as it was formed on the 18th of October, 1922 to the present day. So we have a lot of people on the call to tell the story, a bit like an oral history through the decades, and various people to guide us through. So we're going to start with you, Roger Bolton, with the very early days and the story of Lord Reith. So take us back to the origin.
Well, I wasn't there at the very beginning 100 years ago, though you might think so. We're joined to talk about these early years by Paul Carenza, who's charting the history of God on the air for his own podcast series, and you've probably heard him in Foster Thought and on many other programs, and by Andrew Harrison, Lord Reith's great nephew. Andrew, can I, hello, welcome to the podcast. Hi. There are two Lord Reiths, aren't there? There's the Lord Reith who, up until the moment he left the BBC, and then there is this deeply unhappy man afterwards. But let's go back to the beginning in 1922, and when he got the job. I mean, he was placed there essentially by the radio industries who wanted to sell their sets, therefore there had to be programs on those sets. But it was Reith who decided that the BBC essentially would be a Christian organization, didn't he?
I haven't heard it put quite like that before, Roger, but there's no doubting that the Christian faith was a massive aspect of his life and therefore of the BBC. And Paul, I think, is already onto this. Paul Carenza, who you'll talk to in a moment. Good stuff from you, Paul, on Songs of Praise on Sunday. But this whole thing about vocation and calling was huge. He was a son of the manse. Great grandpa Reith was moderator of the Free Church of Scotland, but Uncle John venerated his minister father when he was in the pulpit, and faith was massive. And as again, Paul's picked up on this, the fact that his wanting to know what he was called before God, the Almighty, as he would refer to God, was to do. And there was this moment in Regent Square Church back in the days before it was flattened in the Blitz, where he heard the minister talking about, who will go, and the sense of calling was massive. And Lord Reith said, I think it's in the archive somewhere, that similarly, those who joined in the early days had a similar, very clear sense of calling, that they were serving a higher purpose.
But he particularly, when asked directly, is the BBC a Christian organisation, said, yes, it is.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
He said, it is, yes. Right. And the state is Christian. We serve the state and so on. Right. And then you notice, of course, Broadcasting House in London. It was Reith's decision to have on the outside the famous reference to God. And I think some people have said, and Paul, have you caught up with this, that Reith believed that there was sort of covenant between the BBC and God. I mean, undoubtedly believed in the early days that this was part of the divine purpose.
Well, I think that yes, pretty much. As Reith was joining the BBC, he didn't in fact hear radio until January of 1923, when he'd been in the post for over a month pretty much, and this thing was just starting out, this idea of broadcasting, even let alone the engineering and the scientific possibilities. So I think what Reith really did was seize this idea that was bubbling away, and throughout 1922 was being used to send mainly concerts and working out how to broadcast news. And I think Reith saw that and thought this was an opportunity. And there's especially this noted point that when he first came to London for work, and in fact he was working as a political secretary at the end of 22, the very first thing he did was go to church, because that of course was very much in his upbringing. And the sermon that he heard was essentially saying, it was from Ezekiel, and it was the minister saying, is there anyone here who can stand up for the soul of the nation? And Reith essentially left church and thought, yes, I will. But he knew he needed to lead something, didn't know what he needed to lead. And I think it was that perfect storm of he had the eagerness and the opportunity, and this burgeoning idea of broadcasting that he just grabbed hold of, because there was not someone ready to lead it at that point. And
but Paul, he was, I was saying that struck me reading about Reith in the very early days is I think in the first year, 1922, 23, he was taken to see the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the exchange was in an hotel, and it was that he didn't go to Lambeth or to Canterbury. The Archbishop came, even then in 1922, to him at an hotel, which is quite extraordinary. And so obviously the Church and the Church of England saw this as a big opportunity to make the BBC the essentially Anglican broadcasting service.
Well, from what I can gather, you have this odd thing at the very, very beginning where Reith really was courting the church leaders. And as you say, he got the Archbishop of Canterbury, invited him to dinner, demonstrated radio. The Archbishop of Canterbury even was very uncertain about it. And Reith even put on radio, and then they didn't like the music. So Reith phoned the BBC, asked for requested a change, and instantly the band started playing Schubert instead. And the Archbishop was amazed, And to begin with, Reith had to really convince the church leaders that this was okay, because some thought this was even vulgar or blasphemous. Can you essentially send a religious service or religious sermon via this, what was seen by many, I think, as a fad? There's a lovely thing I've been doing quite a lot of research into, a pre-BBC religious broadcast. It's often thought the first religious broadcast was Reverend John May on Christmas Eve 22, when the BBC was a couple of months old. But there's one in July as well, and it's a preacher just on his own sending the service from Blackfriars from a factory into his own church in Peckham, but also noting that he was sending this sermon into homes around the southeast as well. And he only broadcast once, and he wrote up afterwards a sense of the occasion. And he actually said this quote. He said, "It doesn't matter a brass farthing to me whether I preach a sermon by wireless again or not. All my aim is that one sermon at least should go out each Sunday by wireless, advertised, wavelength, etc. given," because there was this sense, I think, from some people like this Dr. James Ebenezer Boone, who did the first pre-BBC's religious broadcast, a sense of this is an opportunity. And he actually also said the churches should not let this go by. But I think many church leaders were unconvinced to begin with, and it took Reith to convince them.
Andrew, I just want to talk about Reith himself and what's happening to Reith in the period as he goes to the 20s and 30s and to the point at which he resigns. He's such a contradictory figure, because you think, well, he would only appoint men, and actually appoint a lot of very brilliant women to work with him. And do you detect his faith faltering, or his view of the, in some ways, divine purpose of the BBC altering over that period before he finally left just before the war?
Oh, I can't answer that, Roger. I don't know. I mean, it certainly took its toll with his run-in with the governors. He felt the ire of Churchill because during the general strike, he said, no, you can't use it as an organ of propaganda, and it is an independent broadcasting, and that cost him dearly. So run-ins with him, the governors, eventually took its toll, and he would, as you say, he left a rather sad, and he always said afterwards, after the BBC, I was never fully stretched. Couldn't find anything that compelled him in the same way. So yes, it became a rather sad demise after that.
But did you detect any lack of faith, a loss of faith? So, or when he left, did he still believe that the BBC and broadcasting had a deeply religious purpose?
As far as I know, that he'd very much set the BBC on that course and had maintained that course. I think that was very important to him, as far as I know. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Roger, and thank you to Andrew and Paul as well. I read a quote here. Colin Morris, who was the head of religious broadcasting in the 70s, said that the linchpin of religious broadcasting was the church service in one form or another. And we have on the call lots of producers who've been dealing with BBC worship over the years. Stephen Oliver, are you there?
I'm here.
Hello, Stephen. So tell us about your time at the BBC, which was in the 70s, 80s, until you left and you were ordained, weren't you, towards the end there? But just tell us something about the worship that you produced in those years.
No, I was always ordained when I joined the BBC in network radio in the early 1980s. And I was appointed particularly over the worship programs, which of course included the daily service, the longest running radio program in the BBC's history. and the morning worship on a Sunday. And the daily service in particular was, in my view, fairly moribund at that stage, just in the sense that, and it seems almost impossible to believe this now, the BBC had actually produced its own hymn book and its own service book. And people had been encouraged to get these and then follow the service in their own home. In fact, the daily service began with a letter from somebody to the Radio Times asking for a daily service for the sick. That was how the idea was born. But it had become this particular kind of broadcast worship. But the hymn book contained hymns that I was told were musically impeccable, but hymn tunes that nobody ever would recognize. And they were sung perfectly by the BBC singers. So it had a kind of lack of soul about it, to my mind. And we tried gradually to change that by not always having the BBC singers, sometimes bringing in instruments, certainly changing hymns so that people would recognize them, the tunes, rather than this kind of very erudite kind of music that they were getting before. And then in terms of the Sunday worship, then there were things that we tried to do that were going to engage with people and with people's imagination. So, I mean, Christy Morgan will remember this particularly. We took over 100 Radio 4 listeners to the Holy Land and broadcast a whole week of services, beginning with a Sunday morning Palm Sunday service from St. George's in Jerusalem, and then a daily service each day from different parts, different churches in Jerusalem. And it was something, I think, that was a bit pioneering in those days, though the BBC religious department has done other things very similar since. And then in regard to that Sunday worship, there were things that we did. Actually, I did this after I'd left the BBC, which was to take a theme of holy islands and went to places like Iona and Lindisfarne and so on, and broadcast from there to give a sense of place and what that might do. It's tricky, that, because you have to know particularly what worship is, rather than a kind of just down your way program. But those seem to work quite well. So it's been a period of considerable change, I think, over the years.
Can I come in, Stephen? Michael Wakelin here. Lovely to see you again. Lovely to see you.
Hello, Michael. You haven't changed a bit.
No, neither of you. Well, I've got younger, in fact.
Yes,
I'm interested to know, Stephen, were you across the conversations that took place when the daily service was taken off the mainstream channel and put onto longwave? And I just wonder how those conversations went, because I remember Michael Green saying famously, "I can't drop the daily service because I'm too young to die."
Yes, well, that's true. No, I wasn't. I think by that happened just after I'd left, I think. And it was the admission, Michael got it right there, that the daily service had to continue in some form, but the controller of Radio 4 couldn't actually justify its presence in the schedules, in the main schedules. And so it became this compromise, really, of keeping it always on longwave and not having to ditch it at all. Because there had been kind of rumors before that the daily service might go. Again, it was changing society, changing ways of thinking about things. And it had resulted in a big response, and a big response was, you can't possibly let this program go. Big response to that.
Can I bring in Angela Tilby here? You've been putting some comments in the chat box there, Angela. You were working in BBC Religion during that period as well. You were working on Everyman, I think.
Everyman was much later. I mean, I started on the daily service and Thought for the Day and entirely on radio. And I would like to say something about that, because I do think that the BBC has been an enormous force for ecumenism in this country. The way in which that its department and dealing with worship particularly always had people from non-Anglican backgrounds. And there was a real attempt, I think, and I've still got it my copies of New every morning, which I still use a great deal when I'm doing the prayers at evensong in the various cathedrals where I've ministered, because it is an extraordinarily good piece of ecumenical liturgy, which kept treasured aspects of our big denominations in public view. And I mean, part of its success, I think, is inherited by Choral Evensong on Radio 3, which has done probably more to keep up the standards of choral music and the inclusion of children in worship than almost any other cultural feature of our time. So I'm a bit I'm a bit dismayed by the view that the daily service is endlessly sort of under threat. It has adapted, I think, rather brilliantly to a very different style of worship, of music, of presentation, radio presentation, much less formal, much more chatty, and it continues that ministry and that presence, even though it's only on longwave and DAB. So forgive me just coming in on that, but I felt that was important.
I think there was an interesting debate, and this was part of the crunch of the matter, I think, a very interesting debate, I think, that in the 1980s and probably a bit before, there was a sense in which the daily service and Sunday's morning worship was creating for itself a church of the air. In fact, that phrase was used quite often. And I've got in front of me celebrating 60 years of BBC's radio daily service. I can't believe that was 40 years ago, but it was. But it's headed the Church of the Air. And at what stage do you say that this is reflecting Christianity in its various denominations in this country? And how far are you creating something which you are intended to place alongside all those?
Well, it's a mutual relationship, I think, and it always has been, as it is now with online church, which has been such a help to people during the pandemic. The two belong together. Candle in your home while the gospel was read and all sorts of things. I mean, all these things were sort of part of an ongoing debate, which if you opt out of, you lose completely.
Thank you, Angela. So in that period, about 50 years ago, the Sunday programme was started, and it was started by David Winter, who then became ordained and is in the Oxford diocese, I think, now. But Trevor Barnes, so you were a reporter on the Sunday programme, not from the very beginning, of course, but from quite near the beginning. Tell us a little bit about the origin of the programme and why it came to be that there had to be found a place for religion outside worship, but in the news and current affairs agenda of the day.
Well, I wasn't there at the beginning, so I think really my own involvement was really 81 onwards. But by then it had established itself as something that reported religious news and current affairs. I think it was quite churchy when I started, but as the late 70s gave way to the 80s, there were simply news stories in the air. The Iranian Revolution of 79 put religion or a certain brand of theocracy in a foreign land centre stage. There was the visit of John Paul II in 82 and the role that the churches very often had in being a focus of dissent, say in East Germany. But on the domestic front, news in the 80s, or religious news, seemed to be very prominent. You had the Anglican Church series of reports, Faith in the City in 85, which, if you like, pitted the church, or seemed to be the moment at which the church stopped being the Tory party at prayer. And I remember following things like the miners' strike and being on picket lines for the Sunday programme, where there was church representation there. And then, of course, you got the involvement of the Bishop of Durham, David Jenkins, who was strongly, I think he said, didn't he, the miners should not be defeated. And news liking a row was full of rows of that order. Interestingly, the Bishop of Durham made a a slightly different row, an internal one, when he was wrongly quoted as doubting the resurrection, and there was business with the conjuring trick with bones. Now, he didn't actually say that. He was badly traduced, and it was reported, but he, as senior cleric, became a figure that the news reported on. And then, of course, there was that quite extraordinary moment when, having appeared to question the resurrection, certainly the literalness of the resurrection, York Minster was struck by a bolt of lightning 2 or 3 days after his consecration. And it was interesting that Rosemary Hartill, I don't know what the collective term for religious affairs correspondence is, but we seem to have a full house here today. But it was a measure of her authority that she could ask a question to the bishop. Do you think the bolt of lightning was a sign of God's displeasure? I mean, had that been a purely secular reporter from the newsroom, it could have been easily batted away. But because Rosemary asked it with the context that everybody knows, it reduced the Bishop of Durham to silence, which in itself was a minor miracle, I think.
Thank you. And Mike Waldridge, you were a correspondent who followed eventually Rosemary Hartill. And can I just ask you your reflection of getting religion on the air within news in that period? So the Sunday programme was, 3/4 of an hour. Was it 3/4 of an hour still when it started? But the effort of getting news on the main news bulletins and programmes, was that very difficult in your day?
And in fact, I should just say that I was following directly Ted Harrison, who I think is also on the call. I think I had an advantage, perhaps, in hopes, certainly, that religion would always be an absolutely mainstream subject and issue in the news and in news bulletins, because I had just been a foreign correspondent, if you like, a correspondent in Africa for 9 years immediately before becoming religious affairs correspondent. I've been in first East Africa and then in Southern Africa. And I was very keen, in a way, that what subsequently happened did happen, that in a way then becoming religious affairs correspondent would be no different. I could continue to feel that it was as if I was covering any story in Africa, and then indeed later on, after 6 years as religious affairs correspondent, going on to India as South Asia correspondent. Again, great continuity, in fact, in many ways, because religion had been so much a part of so many people's lives in Africa, then again, the same in South Asia. It's in a way had a reputation, if you like, of covering those sort of stories, and maybe that helped in getting stories on the air. But I found a very good appetite, radio bulletins, television news coverage as well, for religious stories of the kind that Trevor was just talking about. And it was hugely rewarding to be able to do that, feeling that they were generally getting good coverage in the main bulletins, as well as, while correspondent, having the opportunity to go on reporting in more depth and a broader range of stories for Sunday as well. And indeed, on top of all that, to make programs, which I think is a very important aspect, and other religious affairs correspondents, I think, would all have had similar opportunities in many ways, starting off immediately making one series with Ellie McCain, who is on the call, God and Caesar, and others with Norman Winter on the religious landscape of Britain. I think it was almost 10, 12 programs altogether. Another one, Religion in America. All of those were hugely instructive for me. It was a very helpful kind of learning curve for doing the job. And again, maybe contributed to being able to do my best to get a proper coverage for as great a range of religious stories as possible in news output.
What made it different or better, perhaps, than some of the other correspondent jobs that you had in your career, Michael?
In a way, I'm saying it's the same, the great continuity, and there's a sense in which it doesn't stand out as a totally different 6 years in my life. But I can't really think of any other subject that gives you such a spectacular range of events to cover I remember, I think it was actually on my first day in the job, going down and covering what was the first official recognition, certainly within the church, of World AIDS Day in Britain, a very special service in the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey in candlelight and incredibly moving, actually, and getting that into the news output. And then very shortly afterwards, reporting on and indeed doing commentary on, again, the sort of mix you do as a religious affairs correspondent, of George Carey becoming Archbishop of Canterbury. And really not long after that, going with him to Rwanda a few months after the genocide had taken place there. And in a way, because I was covering his visit, gave you insights into the genocide, things to report on and still discover about it at that stage, because a religious dignitary had come, the first of his kind, to go to Rwanda and raise big questions about why the church had been so silent and so on during the genocide. So a massive range of stories alongside the regular ones like the Synod, of course, where I would sit alongside you, Ruth, covering that.
Those were the days.
Well, it certainly was the day when they approved the ordination of women to the priesthood, of course. That was one.
Yes, it was. But, you know, I remember filing stories back into the studio, and one of the studio managers at the other end said, "Is this archived?" Because the Synod had been discussing the same thing for about 7 years, I think, at that stage. So nothing really changes. But Aleem, well, you're on the call, and Harry Farley, both doing the beat now, religion in news. Aleem, just your reflection on what Mike has said then, on the way that the kind of stories that he was covering, does it compare in any way to what you are asked to do, or what you find you're doing at the moment?
Well, in terms of, well, first of all, I feel like, looking at all of the people on this call, I am the least experienced on trying to get faith stories on. All of you have had much more experience of that. But in my 6 months or so in this job, it's very much been focused on the news agenda, but a global news agenda. So the big stories that have sort of pierced through: the attack on Salman Rushdie, the religious dimensions of the war in Ukraine. And there hasn't been much need for lobbying or pushing any side of the sort of religion agenda, I suppose, because it's sort of dictated by events around the world. But there is a recognition in the newsroom that events elsewhere, in Iran, in India, have an impact here. And I'm very lucky, and Mike was touching on this as well, that the beat gives such breadth of opportunity to tell stories, whether it's domestically or globally. So I think I've just carried on some of the work that was started by some of the people on this call. It's definitely moved away, although I found Synod actually surprisingly interesting when I went a couple of months ago. It's moved away from that a little bit, but there's some of that to be reported on too.
Thank you, and Harry Farley, turning to you as well. I mean, it is multi-faith now. That's one of the big differences to the stories that we've been hearing from the earlier days. It's a very big topic to get your head around.
Yeah, it is. It's quite interesting, as Aleem was saying, listening to all the people on this call who've got so much more experience and done this for so many years. But yeah, it's quite interesting. One of the differences that I think in terms of religious reporting now is the multi-faith angle, and I'd say in terms of appetite for news, you know, the appetite for sort of following the intricacies of different debates in the Church of England maybe has gone down, but I'd say the appetite for other religious stories, and, you know, Lee mentioned, you know, the religious influences on the war in Ukraine. We did, you know, stories on a number of Jewish people fleeing Russia, feeling like they are not welcome anymore in Russia. And so it's stories like that I think there is a real appetite for, and a real interest in from the newsroom. So I think just it's interesting hearing how religious affairs news has changed. But I think the appetite is certainly still there for it, maybe slightly different to how it's been done, and slightly different to how it's been in decades previously.
Mm. And I know that you're very busy all the time whenever I see you. So it's great that you're both on the call. Thank you. I'd like to go to Leo Devine next, and Alex Strangways Booth, to the unsung heroes of religion on local radio around the UK.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. I mean, I started my career in local radio, very proud of that. And I think just before we speak to Alex, one of the things, picking up what Harry and Aline were saying, particularly about multi-faith, is I think local radio, which has always been very connected to its community. I work for Radio Leicester, the first station, which celebrates 55 years on the 8th of November. I wasn't there in 1967, but I was there in 1985. It was a very diverse city. It still is, in fact, more so. Our faith program, which I used to present, I was a reporter during the week, and I used to present the faith program on the Sunday, was all about speaking to the local mosques. It was about speaking to the Gurdwaras. I knew the people who built the Jain temple, and I knew the local rabbi very well. It wasn't the Christian broadcasting service. It very much was about representing our faith communities. Alex, you still work for the BBC, and you've got an overview of the whole BBC network in terms of content for faith programs. Is that something that you agree with?
Yeah, so I started working at the BBC in 1996 at Radio Cleveland, which is now Radio Tees. And somebody asked me in a corridor if I would present Sunday breakfast about 6 months into my time there. I mean, it was like, you want to present Sunday breakfast? So I did. I didn't know anything about religious broadcasting. And at that time, local radio Sunday breakfast had a lot of volunteers involved. It was like, you know, that it had God squads, and it was seen as like a really separate bit of the BBC from the rest of the output that was run by volunteers. But I came from the newsroom and I was the breakfast producer. So I just brought the same skills that I used in weekday breakfast to Sunday breakfast. So it, you know, there were moments of tension. Also working with me, seconded by the Church of England, was a young curate by the name of Graham Usher, who's now Bishop of Norwich. So I always say that I've been in religious broadcasting long enough to have seen a curate become a bishop, which I don't know whether that's a good thing or not. So you know, what's happened, I think, since 1996 is that the Sunday breakfast shows have become a much more professionalised bit of the BBC local radio output. So they're produced by newsroom journalists, and the presenters are often journalists as well. I started to work for this bit, so I produced content for all 39 local radio stations, and I started doing this about 10 years ago, and I did it with Ashley Peatfield, who's now left. He was the religion editor for local radio, a great champion of religious broadcasting on the BBC. And we did, you know, our mission really was to do strong, relevant news stories that would break through into network radio as well. So, you know, we did FOIs to find out about the number of falls in healthcare chaplains. We did hospital and mental health care chaplains, the fact the country's running out of burial space. You know, we did a whole bigger bit of research about attitudes to immigration among faith communities. So we tried, and very successfully, to bring stories from a local level onto a national level so that we could feed religion stories into the whole of the BBC output. And
I think across that period, I mean, it really came of age, didn't it? I think if you can put it that way. And another thing I'm interested in is, we were hearing from Stephen before and Angela about, you know, the Church of the Air, and certainly during the pandemic, again, on that theme of connecting communities. I mean, you were instrumental in creating those churches of the air, or those faith meetings of the air across local radio, which played a big part in sustaining people through the pandemic.
Yeah, I was a Johnny come lately to Sunday worship on the radio. I have no experience of producing worship programs at all, but during the pandemic, we started to make these 30-minute radio services. And obviously, I mean, I just made them as radio programs. And I was really, really proud of the Sunday services because they served such a need. I mean, they were a real proper public service during the time of the pandemic. They were so popular. Our audiences, we did stop doing them. And you know, our audiences were very sad about that, but we do them at special moments. So I did some when the Queen died. I'm doing a Christmas Day one. So local radio's never ever done services on Christmas Day before, but that's now something I'm just expected to do, and to come together as a network. So all the local radio stations will play that service at 7 o'clock on Christmas Day. But I also have made more bespoke programs, like a bit like Mike Wooldridge was saying, you know, that idea of making programs as well as just doing news. So I do a Keeping Faith at Christmas and a Keeping Faith at Easter, which is a chance to feature stories of hope and inspiration and, you know, amazing people in local communities, which again, all the radio stations will play out at the same time. So what has changed dramatically during the pandemic is this idea that local radio can come together as a network and broadcast to, you know, its entire audience when it comes to religious affairs broadcasting. Of course, there is only me doing it though.
I thought, well, that sounds like local radio.
I mean, and our lovely Sunday teams around the country, but resources are scarce, and it's an interesting time for local radio.
Well, there's a story we've heard before. I think Aleem actually started in local radio as well. Was it Radio York? I think Aleem, wasn't it? Just one little story before I hand back to Ruth is that I ran some of the BBC television regions later in my career. In BBC Southwest, that actually started in 1924, and I found an oral archive from my predecessor's predecessor called Clarence Good, and he complains in this oral archive that he was summoned by Lord Reith to London because he'd been dobbed in by the Bishop of Plymouth for appointing Catholics. That was his story. It's a long time ago.
I mean, can I just jump in really quickly and just say that we also did long reflect. You have to keep in mind that local radio audiences don't listen to the rest of BBC output. It's like that. We know that from the research. They're not hearing Thought for the Day. So we did long reflections all through the pandemic from other faiths as well. And I currently have a team of 3 producers who work in the different faith communities, creating content for all the local radio stations. So we've built amazing bridges during the pandemic with different faith groups around the country.
Well, we're very proud of our local radio roots, aren't we, Ruth? We are. And that's a very neat segue into Thought for the Day. So thank you very much, Alex. Anyone would think we planned that. Very pleased to have Christine Morgan with us, former head of BBC Religion and Ethics. I think I've got your title right. And obviously in charge of Thought for the Day. And you've got a book out. Must make sure we plug that with some selections from the time when you were there. So Thought for the Day, what is its purpose, or what has been its purpose over the years?
Well, it's really interesting listening to Alex there, and she mentioned the words need and public service. And I think they've been really important in everything we've done in religion, actually, and certainly over the time that been listened to, being talked about today. But even just the 50 years of Thought for the Day, you know, it used to be a devotional slot. And when the Today programme became a hard news programme, then the religious slot had to change with it and start talking about the concerns of the day and bring a faith perspective. But from that time, actually putting the book together, I've realised that there is a huge story, an untold story of the changing face of Britain that has come out through the Thought for the Day. And you know, I know there were a lot of important women broadcasters before 1970, but on the whole, it was white male Christian clerics. And then the women came on slowly. And then, but the important thing, and as we're just talking about local radio stations, we introduced the voices from ethnic communities, from the Windrush generation and African and Caribbean, and all the different communities who've settled in this country and have something to say, and we need to share, and we need to learn not just to live, but to live together. And I think what Thought for the Day did was that it produced a place for people to be heard. And I mean, everyone thought religion was fading away, and 9/11 happened. And, you know, I've always said religion does its bad in public and it's good in private. And we've never shied away from saying the harm done in religion. But the vast majority of religion is done is good in private. And I think the other thing that Thought for the Day has done is it's had a range of voices who've been able to talk about faith in a way that has helped people cope with the news and the cut and thrust of all the controversy and the conflict. I think that people want to know about goodness and values and faith that works. And they're really open to spiritual reflection. You know, the idea that if you know, you're not you don't go to a religious service, that you're not a person that doesn't want someone to help you make connections you wouldn't make for yourself, and be open to the sense of the spiritual. I think people used to write to us and say, we're really glad you're there. And that's really helpful.
There have been questions, haven't there, about its continued relevance within a hard news format, 10 to 8 in the morning, slowing up the pace or seeming to kind of change tack when people are interested in other things. And I'm just wondering whether you feel that it does have a secure future. Well,
it's, you know, there's a new editor now, and actually I'm a great fan of Wenna Griffiths. I think she's a really good editor. I mean, it's hard to predict the future, but people have been saying that for ages, Ruth. And actually, there is still an audience out there who want to have that different lens on the news, and they want to be able to hear different perspectives from other faiths. And I think that it's easy to talk up that there's no place for it anymore. I don't actually think that's true.
I think there's a lot more support for Thought for the Day now than there was. I mean, I used to produce it in my 20s, ages and ages ago, and the Today programme, I absolutely hated it. And there was a lot of, there were attempts to sort of create polls of audiences to say, you know, you don't want this, do you? And the result always came back, yes, we do. It was one of the most popular items on Today. And I think actually more recently, just as Christine has said, there's been more public recognition since 9/11 that religion is still a very potent factor in today's world, and there is a place for it which is recognised. Quite who the boundaries are about who gets to talk on it, that's still open for debate, I would guess, and will be for a long time. But I think there's much less hostility than I can remember there being in the early 70s.
Do the presenters talk to you after you've done a Thought for the Day, Angela?
Do other presenters?
Do the presenters of the Today programme pick you
Well,
up
they
on
used to, when it was live and you could go into a studio, and yes, often I've had some really good conversations over the years. But now, of course, since the pandemic, at least if you live in Portsmouth, there aren't any radio studios anymore. You have to do it pre-record, so you don't get that interaction. And I'm really sorry about that, because it was a good moment. You began to sense that people, you know, were not only listening, but they wanted to engage further.
Well, it feels different to be pre-recorded as well, I imagine.
It takes forever, yeah, because you redo it instead of just going there and it's over.
Yeah, and you're not interacting with the presenters either. But you just Thought for the Day this morning. Just give us in one sentence what you said.
I was trying to say that the BBC contained our national conversation, and that was a good thing.
Thank you. You called it a temple, which I thought was interesting. The
BBC was probably the way that Broadcasting House looked like a temple, you know, all that Eric Gill architecture and all the rest of it. You did have a feeling that you were entering sort of sacred ground, but very contested ground as well. I mean, temples are often violent places as well as places of peace and hope.
Thanks, Angela. And you've neatly brought us to the present day. Well, you can't get much more present than this morning's Thought for the Day. And I'm going to hand over to Michael Wakelin now, because we're going to look at religion as it is in the present day on the BBC.
Thanks, Ruth. And just a note of acknowledgement to the legends of religious broadcasting who are on this call. Thanks so much for joining us. Please do stay in touch with the Religion Media Centre. We want to stay in touch with you. And if you don't get our daily news bulletin, you should be ashamed of yourselves. You can sign up for it. It's all free. But yeah, about the present day, my memory of being head of religion was a sense of trying to walk up an escalator that was coming down the other way at increasing speed. So it was very frustrating. So I'm interested now to turn to Dan Tierney, if I may, Dan. You're currently in the department, as it were, working on programmes like The Moral Maze. What's the mood now? Do you feel very supported in what you're offering to the networks?
Yes, I think so. I think the mood at the moment is, I mean, it was alluded to, but obviously post 9/11, there was an assumption that religion, faith was something that was personal, perhaps dwindling away. And really now I think the mood is that we all have an inner life. Our moral values are shaped by our inner lives, and quite often our inner lives have a faith and a religious component that we might not necessarily talk more openly about. And I think in big series that we did in recent years with the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Morality in the 21st Century, it was kind of reaching into that sense that we don't necessarily talk the language of morality as much as we used to, because we're a much less, I guess, church-driven, church-governed society, but there is still something there. And I think in terms of the commissioning of programming today, I think there's very much, I'm thinking of things like, Lent talks, for example. Lent talks sounds very Reithian, Lent talks, but in reality, it is about human experience and explaining the role of faith in human motivation. And it does this in an incredibly relatable way, and in a way that people can reflect upon in their own lives. So I think really it's addressing some of the quiet yearnings that we all have, but in a kind of a very polarized political climate, we may not express as openly as we might wish to, or maybe we might not wish to.
In terms of commissioning that you mentioned there, I know that the Moral Maze slot has been put out to tender. What's your understanding of that? Is the Moral Maze going to carry on, or are they looking for a new format in there?
Well, I think that's an open question. I think that's obviously a question for Radio 4. But I think in that slot, I think what they're looking for is exactly that sense of coming to a program that is a conversation that shows how our worldviews and our values don't always fit neatly, and it's a space to be able to explore that. And I think that when we think about our multi-faith society, we have to learn to be able to explore all of our potentially competing values and opinions and views in a space where we can have where we can be respectful and acknowledge each other's differences. And I think that's really the space for that program on the schedule. And it's something that that's been very important to me as a producer of that program for the last 5 years or so.
Congratulations on keeping it going so well. Can I turn to
Can
Anna
I just
now?
Can I just jump in there, Michael?
Yes, you may. Yeah.
I think
Stephen started it.
I did start it, yes, but I'm not claiming any great glory of that. But I think what it does illustrate is that the department was very supportive and very able to cross the different genres of broadcasting. So many of the producers, of course, did lead the daily service. And if you had a good idea, it didn't matter whether you were in worship bit of the department or not. The department would support you in making that case to the controllers, be they 2, 3, or whatever. And this is a prime example of that. Although I started it, there was huge support from the department. And during the making of those programs, there was a lot of information, a lot of cross-fertilization going on that actually made those programs significantly better, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Stephen. Can I turn to Anna Nami, who's the director of the Sanford St Martin Trust? Just to tell us a little bit about how it is from your end, because religious broadcasting back in the day, I remember we had a clean sweep one year when I was there, but is it still the case now that the best programs the best religious programs are coming from the religious broadcasting team at the BBC?
There's a really complicated question, Michael. I mean, I think one of the things that we've seen, and you've actually already touched on this, talking about how Moral Maze is currently, so to speak, out for tender. So is Songs of Praise, of course. It means that the BBC's financial situation has changed so much that it means that the pressure that's been put on the Religion and Ethics Department has been all the huger. There are less resources, essentially, to go around. So are the best programs on religion still being made by the department? Oh, is that such a, from the trust perspective, the answer to that can only be yes and no, which is a non-answer, obviously. There are three different kinds of religious broadcasting out there. There are the worship programs that we've talked about. There are the sort of factual programs, which again, a lot of the people who are sitting here in this meeting have made. They've been involved in news and current affairs. They're coming at it with that. And then there are the more generalized programs that also deal with religious and ethical themes, ones that are made perhaps with by people who don't necessarily come from a religious background, although they may. So, I'm thinking of sort of BBC dramas like Broken, for instance, which was not a religious commission, I don't think. It was a drama commission, as was Time, Jimmy McGovern's most recent piece, which also deals with religious themes and won a Sanford St. Martin Award. And these are excellent programs, but they're not obviously coming from religion and ethics, which tends to deal with more factual programs. But I think the real issue here is about the increased pressure on producers and content makers to attract audiences with less funding. And it's the funding, which is really, I think, if we're talking about what's happening at the BBC now, the most critical and crucial issue.
Sure, thanks very much. But we've perhaps got one of your award winners with us, I believe, Nick Hamer. Are you there, Nick? Are you with us?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon.
Oh yeah, okay, so congratulations on your Sanford St. Martin. And this was a programme that you didn't intend to be a religious programme, is that right? Tell us about it.
Well, I'm a religious person. I'm very interested in religion. It's a documentary, and I did not intend it to be a religious programme, but it certainly wasn't commissioned by the BBC religious broadcast.
The monks of Mount St. Bernard Abbey, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's called Brotherhood: The Inner Life of Monks, and it was an acquisition by BBC. So they didn't commission it. There was no editorial agenda with the program other than me as an independent filmmaker pursuing my own interests.
Right. And so how did you approach it then? And what was the impact of the program?
Well, how did I approach it? Well, I approached it in the same way I approach all my films, which is I live my life and I look around for what intrigues me and interests me, and I follow it and I tell those stories. The film Brotherhood: The Inner Life of Monks really is about an aging community of Cistercian monks in the Leicestershire countryside who are, average age over 85. They're in a sense dying out, and they can no longer afford to live the way they have always lived, which was as dairy farmers. So they need to find a new way of providing for themselves. So they're opening a brewery, and it follows the story of this community of old men transitioning from dairy farmers to brewers. But of course, that's in the context of their religious life. Mm-hmm. But the film doesn't so much. I mean, it is about religion, but it doesn't even say the word, I don't think, Rule of Saint Benedict or Cistercian. I don't think that's really mentioned in the film. The word Roman Catholic isn't even in the film. So it's more about the characters within this community and their own personal spiritual journeys. I mean, the central theme is probably about, it's a universal theme. It's about coming to terms with our own mortality as human beings. So that's why the film has an appeal, and that's why the film was acquired by the BBC, not as a religious program at all, but as a general interest documentary.
Can we still watch it? Is it available on iPlayer?
I'm afraid it's not available on iPlayer anymore. It was on there for a year. It can now be viewed on most other streaming platforms.
Okay.
But that's under a different title outside the city. which was the original title for the theatrical release of the film.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. I just want one more person, Ruth, then back to you, and then we'll be closing. Matthew Napier, are you with us?
I am.
Matthew, editor of Songs of Praise, my old stomping ground. So how's that going now? We always used to worry about Songs of Praise being put on ever earlier in the afternoon, and now it's now at lunchtime, isn't it? I guess. So how's it going? It looks good on air.
Well, that's kind of you to say so. And hello to a few familiar faces and voices out there from years gone by. Yeah, it's now at 1:15 on BBC One, unless it's on BBC Two because of some sport or other that kicks us over to the other side. And with the World Cup coming up later this year, we've already been warned of lots of BBC Two. So other than that, yeah, we're still going. We began in October 1961. 3,000 odd programs since. We celebrated 60 years last year in 2021. And yeah, I mean, I feel a bit privileged in TV because obviously we get reasonable budgets compared to a lot of the people here in radio, but it still always feels like a hard work to get 35 minutes of television ready in time with the resources that we have. We're now in the independent sector, having left the BBC 5 years ago. And yeah, we maintain the format that we always have done. There've been lots of machinations and manifestations, but we're largely hymns sandwiched between stories, or stories sandwiched between hymns. We try to maintain that, and we've been everywhere. We've told lots of stories about lots of things across the UK, and we're going through a tender process yet again.
Are you going to win it?
Without getting too political, we can't win it in the current format because we're a co-production with two independents coming together, and they are no longer going to work together. So whatever happens will be a new company. Ever
so briefly, just because of time, I'm sorry to cut you short, but
that's fine.
I gather there's a lot of editorial input from the commissioner. Is that right? That didn't used to be the case in the day.
No, it didn't, and I'm rather pleased there is, in a weird way, because at least we're getting guidance now on what the BBC or what our commissioner gives us is that outsiders, if you like, view of what we have all been working on for weeks and weeks on end. She just comes in as an audience member, watches it once, and gives us some very handy tips. Daisy Scalchi is excellent. Before we were self-commissioning, so no one was there to judge how well we did other than ourselves, and I think that was a danger because we were not we were making programs for us sometimes rather than the audience, and that's easy to forget that's what we're here for, that half an hour of comfort and sing along and uplifting stories every week.
Sure. Matthew, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
I appreciate it. I'm going to hand back to Ruth now. Ruth.
I think we're going to have to draw it to a close. Although after we've finished the recording, we're not going to shut the Zoom call. If you'd like to, having met one another for the first time for ages, hang on. But I would just like to ask to end the call with two people. So I'd just like to end the call by going to Christine, first of all, Christine Morgan. As you reflect on this whole hour of conversation, so the society now, with the census results are coming out soon, the number of people who affiliate with Christianity is likely to drop below 50%. The number of people ticking the box non-religion is going to increase. What has been the impact of religious broadcasting, do you think, if any, on the life of the nation, the religion in the nation?
It's been vital. And I think that we've always had an audience with all shades of belief and unbelief, and we've had to find ways of talking to them. And the decline in religious literacy is a factor. Our production teams that have to sit there and think, how are we going to talk to people about this? How are we going to communicate? But, Mona Siddiqui's often said, we've got to find ways of talking to people about religion in ways that they can identify with. That is our job. And what we can actually bring with it is absolutely key. We are giving people a different way of looking at the world, at what's going on, at the news, at the concerns of the day. I think there's actually, we're also filling something of a cultural void. I mean, I can remember a journalist who said to me, do you know, I was brought up as an Anglican. I know all the themes and stories. It feels like a formative part of my education, almost like, you know, being taught about Shakespeare. And he said, I ditched my faith in my early 20s, and I've got 2 girls, 9 and 7, and they know nothing about Christianity. And I now feel really bad that I've deprived them of something. Now, those 2 girls actually are just as likely to respond to, you know, spiritual input and what we were talking about earlier, that sense of something bigger that people actually will really respond to. But I think there is something also about that bigger picture of who we are as a society and how we treat each other, that people know there is an element of in faith. And I think the fact that people, you know, it's not a numbers game. Religion today is culture and community, which is much needed, and it's identity. It's the common good, it's shared values, it's all sorts of things. And good religious broadcasting can absolutely speak into that. And so it should. And it needs people who are passionate about it and who know about it, not because they're trying to sell something, but because actually there is a need and it is up to us to meet it.
Thank you. And last word to Andy Harrison, the great nephew of the great Lord Reith. Reflecting on what he started, yeah. How do you reflect on what he started?
I've no idea, Ruth. All I would say was, you said the question you put in the chat box, am I proud is my great uncle? And I thought, oh, I don't know. No, I'm more excited about the fact that here was one person who was open to God's call on his life. And I think that's an exciting thing. That's what makes me interested in him and in the bigger questions. Proud of the BBC, proud of the religious department. I mean, who wouldn't be listening to this discussion this morning? It's fantastic, and I think we should all be proud and confident in what's being done and achieved through the religious department and religious broadcasting.
And also news.
And news.
Yes. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for taking part today, and do join us again next week.